make them a CRM developer. If you are just joining us, just a reminder of the objectives of this course is to help take a developer that's familiar with Microsoft technologies and teach you the necessary skills to become a CRM developer. CRM developers use a broad spectrum of technologies in working with CRM and building solutions, so it is important that you have some general understandings of some of the technologies. Some of the things that we assume that you have some experience with is .NET, JavaScript experience, XML, HTML, and basic data modeling experience. You don't have to be experts at all of these. In fact, Pluralsight offers courses on many of these topics that can help you become more proficient if you find yourself a little bit short in one of those areas. In this part 4, we will be focusing mainly on server-side usage of CRM, so having experience with Visual Studio and C# development is probably the most important for moving forward with this part 4. If you happen to be just joining us now for part 4, I would encourage you to go back through part 1, 2, and 3. That's where we started some of the essential learning of the overview of CRM, how to configure, how to work with solutions, how to do some of the data modeling in part 1. Part 2, we looked at customizing CRM. We looked at it from a developer's point of view, how we could go and do some of the essential customizations, changing forms and a variety of the other things, as well as the client-side extensibility. In part 3, we looked at working with CRM data, so working with the organization service, as well as working with the metadata that CRM offers. Working with the CRM data is a core essential for working with part 4, where we move server to server-side extensibility and we start building things like plugins. So if you aren't comfortable working with the organization service, querying data, executing CRM services, I would go back to part 3 and make sure you get comfortable with that before you proceed with part 4. In part 4, we're going to be building on those skills as we look at server-side things like custom workflow activities, business process flows, and other things where that type of technology becomes essential for working with them. You might be wondering what we have in store for you in part 4. We're going to start out by talking about plugins. Plugins represent one of the lowest level extensions that developers can do with Dynamic CRM. They let you build code, custom code, that runs as part of the main or the operation or the event processing pipeline of Dynamic CRM. So we'll learn about eventing, what happens before CRM creates a record, for example, and after, and how we can hook in plugins to run custom code, make changes to the request, or do things after the request has been processed. We'll then move on to talk about processes, different types of processes. CRM has several different business process flows, workflows, dialogues. Business process flows is the first one we'll talk about. It's actually a little bit more client-side, and it was introduced since we started the client-side section, so we wanted to come back and make sure to cover it because it is essential to understand how it fits with the other types of processes. Business process flows provide a guided step-by-step process for a user to walk through one or more entities worth of data that they're filling out. Think about it, in the past we used to have many windows opening up. This smooths things out so a user is able to step through a process in a logical sort of way. The steps in individual stages provide guidance on what they need to complete before they move to the next stage. This is client-side technology, but it stores the definition for the business process flow using XAML, and it stores it the same way we store workflows and dialogues that are more server-side technologies. The business process flow is shown to the user as a process control on the forms of the entities that are involved in the process. Developers can interact with that control using client scripting that we learned in the prior module. There's some new set of APIs that the developer can use to control, move forward, move back, and check the required steps and so forth of the business process control, as well as hide and collapse the control. We'll then move on to workflows. Workflows execute server-side. They execute in Windows Workflow Foundation that has been integrated with CRM by the CRM team, so you don't have to worry about any of the hosting of the workflow runtime or anything like that. It's all been done for you by the CRM team. You have to worry about building the workflow. Workflows are a little different than plugins. Plugins are all implemented in code, and they have a more monolithic feel to them. They only respond to events. You don't have the ability to call a plugin on demand, where the workflow you actually have the ability to run it on demand, so a user could say, I want to run this workflow against a record, or they could be triggered based on basic events like create, update, delete, change of the owner, things like that. Workflows are sequential and consist of a series of steps that you can design either using the web editor or using Visual Studio. Now, I will tell you that the majority, almost all of the workflows are typically created are done through the web editor, even though you can do it in Visual Studio, because the ones that you do in the web editor are portable to the different deployments of CRM, whereas the ones that you do through Visual Studio are only applicable to run in CRM on-premise. Another reason workflows are powerful is because they can be created by other than just developers. Non-developers, functional consultants can also create workflows. They can leverage the built-in steps. These are things like create, send an email. They can also use custom workflow activities we'll be talking about later in the course to build custom logic that can be executed as needed in one of the steps in the sequence of the workflow. In some cases, you may find yourself making a choice between implementing a plugin or implementing a workflow with custom workflow activities. Implementing the workflow with custom workflow activities to do the custom code tends to be a little bit more flexible, allowing a broader set of the team to work on building the overall solution. Also, if you have to change the tends to be a little bit easier to change the workflow and reorganize things, moving the step that called the custom workflow activity rather than having to rewrite all the code in a plugin. After we cover workflows, we'll move on to dialogues. Dialogues are created using the same web editor that you use to create workflows, but offer a distinct difference in that they're designed to interact with the user. So the user is presented a page. That page has prompt and responses on it that allow you to ask the user questions, and then it goes through a series of steps just like a workflow. So it would provide sequentially through those steps, and then it would show another page, and it would repeat that until the dialogue finished. Dialogues are great for executing task-like things. So as opposed to the business process flow, which might be a sales process that exists over multiple sessions, dialogues are intended to be completed in one user interaction session. So they may see multiple pages, click next, next, next like a wizard, but then be done with it. They wouldn't walk away, go to lunch, and expect to pick it up a day later after lunch or a month later like you would business process flows that are intended to retain the process across a longer period of time. Custom workflow activities is the next topic we'll cover. These are one of my favorite extending features of Dynamic CRM for a developer because they let you build building blocks that can be reused in one or more workflows. Custom workflow activities, once registered with CRM, show up in the web editor and allow somebody editing a workflow, a dialogue, or even a custom action we'll be talking about later to specify that as a step in the flow of the workflow. Now, as a developer, you can define input parameters and output parameters, defining what you expect to be handed into you. Those show up in the web editor, allow a visual design experience for somebody building the workflow. In your code, you get access to those input parameters. You do your processing using things like the organization data service, or you might call out to a third-party service for integration. Maybe you're doing geocoding and you call out to get the geocode, and your output property has the latitude, longitude to be able to be used later in the workflow. Custom workflow activities are really powerful because they let you build fragments that can be reused in multiple workflows. Our final module will cover custom actions. Custom actions are unique in that they let a developer define a custom action that, just like you have other messages in CRM such as create, won, lost, as we talked about, those are requests that you can make on the opportunity. You can define custom actions that can be called against an entity or global. The interesting thing about custom actions, though, is the actual logic for implementing the custom action is intended to be done similar to building a workflow. So it could be done by a functional consultant that you would provide the steps, and then the custom action is really intended to be called by the developer. There's not an easy way to call it without using some code. So you could call it from JavaScript, you could call it from server-side code, you could call it from C# running in a batch program that was designed to integrate with CRM. So there's a variety of usages that we'll be covering with it. The simplest way of thinking about it is it allows you to define a new message that processed and the steps that go along with doing that. Really intended to be created by a functional consultant, but we'll also talk about some more advanced ways that you can hook a plugin up to that custom action message. So we have a lot to cover in this course, so let's get started. Hi, this is David Yak, and in this module we're going to talk about building plugins for Microsoft Dynamics CRM. Plugins are built by creating a .NET class that implements the iPlugin interface that's provided in the CRM assemblies. Now, while that may sound simple, it is pretty simple at the heart of it. You implement one single method called the execute, and that's where the bulk of your code goes that does all the custom logic. Now, there's a lot more to building a plugin that we'll be talking about throughout the rest of this module. The class you build should be in a class library. That class library will need to be signed with a key so that it has a unique identifier to it, but it doesn't need a public certificate or anything fancy. It just allows it to be whitelisted or blacklisted in case something goes wrong with the plugin once it's deployed or used offline by a CRM client. You don't have to use any special templates to build a plugin. You can just create a normal class, reference the .NET assembly for CRM, and then implement the iPlugin interface. Now, there are templates that are provided by the CRM Developer Toolkit. We'll talk about those later in the module. Those provide a little bit more helpers to get you going, but at the heart of it, it's really about implementing iPlugin and the single execute method. Simply building a .NET class that implements iPlugin, though, won't tell CRM that you want your plugin to be invoked. That happens by registering the assembly with CRM. The assembly then detects the individual classes that implement the iPlugin interface. Those becomes types that are available in the plugin registration tool that you can then register steps on. An example of registering a step would be informing CRM that you want your plugin to be invoked every time create is called for the account entity, and you want your plugin to be called before CRM creates the record in the database because you want to do some validation. When you register your step, there's a lot of choices you'll make. One of the major ones you'll make is whether you run synchronous or asynchronous. Synchronous means that it happens before the user gets control back. This provides a lot of flexibility in being able to have the results immediately, but also can slow down the user getting the results that they were looking for when the page refreshes. Asynchronously happens in the background, provides a good way to fire the request off and let it process in the background. The user won't be impacted if that takes a second or two to complete processing. We'll look at a lot of the other options you can use when registering a plugin as we move through the rest of the module. Before we get too far in building actual plugins, let's talk about a few of the usage scenarios that you might encounter. Over the last few releases of CRM, workflows have become a lot more powerful, and in some cases, you'll use those instead of plugins. However, plugins are probably the most powerful way that you can extend dynamic CRM because they don't have the same boundaries you have with other extensibility options. For example, you can actually create a plugin that registers on every single event that happens in CRM. Now, most times you wouldn't want to do that, but that simple power of being able to do that, whereas with a workflow, if you wanted to respond to 3 different entities, you'd have to create 3 different workflows and hook them up to those individually. So you couldn't just create one plugin and hook it up like you can, and that becomes very powerful. Now, what are some of the things that you might do with a plugin? You might do complex platform level validation. So in a second, we're going to talk about the different stages of the event pipeline where your code can get invoked. One of the first ones is the pre-validation, and that's where you might do some validation. You might need to do some calculations. You might need to do some calculations that you couldn't do client side or that you couldn't do with simple business rules. Another example, you might be setting default values. This is another thing that some of that could be handled with business rules. If all you're saying, if the country is equal to US, set the credit limit to a default value of 500 if one wasn't provided. That's an example of something that could be done with a business rule, wouldn't require a plugin. But let's say that you need to go retrieve other CRM data. You need to query another entity, look up a value based on data that was provided on the record, and set the credit limit based on that value. Or perhaps even go call out and do a integration with a third-party system, such as a credit reporting bureau, where you want to pull the credit based on an ID that was provided on the application. You want to get the credit score, and based on the credit score, you want to do some settings of some values. All kinds of things like that could be done with a plugin. Another interesting scenario with integrations or even internal system integration is the ability to hook into the request both before it goes to the CRM operation as well as after. For example, if you were doing a retrieve of a record, you might register a plugin post-operation, so you would get control after CRM had retrieved the data. You could do a call out to another internal system, retrieve a value that you want to inject into the response that the user sees. That's an example of how deep the level of extensibility the plugins offer. And of course, at the end of the day, executing complex business logic. You simply have to implement the execute method, what code you put in there. If you call some math libraries, do various calculations, that's all up to you how you want to handle it. But the bottom line is, the thing to remember that's most important about plugins is look for scenarios where you can get the work done quickly. Plugins are not intended to be long-running processes. That's what workflows do. Workflows can run for 6 months, a year without having any problems. Plugins, as you'll see in the most restrictive scenario, have a 2-minute limit. But more realistic, if you're running synchronous, the user's waiting for it to happen, and I don't know any users that like to wait around for over a few seconds for the form to repaint on their screen. Understanding the CRM event pipeline is essential to be able to build productive plugin. Hooking up to the wrong place in the pipeline, your plugin's just not going to do what you expect it to do. Best case, worst case, you're going to throw some errors. This pipeline gets invoked every time a request happens in CRM. What causes requests? Everything from the user hitting save on a page, creating a new record, updating a record, those all cause it to go through this pipeline. The same thing occurs when a developer goes through the API and does a create call through the API. It goes through this same pipeline as the request is processed. Ultimately, the request is what comes into the pipeline, is processed by the main operation, stage 30 that you see on here, and then the output from the main operation is the response that goes back to the caller. Remember, every call that you do in CRM really is a request and response paradigm that it's using. Even if you use the create method on the iOrganization service, under the covers, it still creates a create request and a create response comes back from making that call. So when the request comes in, it goes through the pipeline starting at the pre-event. The pre-event has two stages, pre-validation and pre-operation. Pre-validation, you'll notice, is outside the transaction. So it's really intended for doing things like validation, like is this a valid value? You save a slight amount by terminating the transaction before it gets into the pre-operation stage where a transaction is already created. Now, it is possible, keep in mind, to be in a transaction in the pre-validation stage in the scenario where you're in a plugin, your plugin creates another record, there's a plugin on that entity's create. When that plugin runs on that entity's create, it would be in a transaction the time it came into that stage 10. Normally that doesn't matter. I like to think of always being in a transaction unless I'm doing something. And the reason that you want to be aware of the transaction scope is if you were to throw an unhandled exception, it's going to roll back and CRM's going to undo everything you did in your plugin. Worse than that, you can actually hook up multiple plugins to a message. So when a create of an account happens, for example, I could have 3 plugins hooked up to that. Each would get processed in the order. 2 of them could be on pre-operation. 1 of them could be on post. And if that post-operation one failed, everything done in the first 2 plugins that ran would also be rolled back. So it's very essential when you're writing plugins to understand that you can impact other processing and ultimately the end user getting the results from that create or whatever they were trying to accomplish in CRM. Oftentimes, even though you have an unexpected error, you may be better handling it, logging it, and doing some other business process to handle it rather than throwing up the unhandled exception, which would block the user from creating, updating, or doing whatever they were trying to do. Now, as we move down to the pre-operation stage, this is where, if you're setting default values, this is a great place to do it. And the reason for that is you're getting control before CRM has actually, in the case of a create or an update, before CRM has done the actual create on the database. And in this pre-operation stage, you have access in memory to the request that's about to be processed. So in the case of creating an account, you'd be able to update the memory buffer with additional fields that you want to default values on before CRM creates the record. The big advantage of this is that CRM will do the create of the record and have your values, and you don't have to do a separate update. If you were to set those default values in the post-operation stage, you would have to go do an additional update. Now, that update has 2 impacts of calling it. First of all, you're calling update again, which has overhead. Second, if anybody was triggering based on an update being done on this entity, which we'll talk about triggers a little more throughout the course, that trigger would cause another plugin or workflow to potentially run. In fact, if you don't set up your plugin to correctly trigger for updated fields that you care about, you might find yourself re-entering your own plugin, causing a loop. CRM will terminate that after the 7th time. It'll actually terminate you for looping, but you don't want to set yourself up for that situation. So if you can avoid doing an update on the same record that you're processing the request on, you can do that in the pre-operation, and then the main operation, when a create happens or an update, will take care of updating the data. So you might be asking, why would I use post-operation? Well, there's some things that you can't do before the record is created. For example, if you needed the ID to be assigned to the record or the record to be in the database to hook up associated records. Let's say you were creating an account and you were going to go create 5 tasks that you wanted to have followed up on that new account and you were automating that. You couldn't create those 5 tasks for follow-up until the actual account had been created in the main operation. Not only did you need the ID that was going to be assigned, you needed the record to be in the database. Otherwise, calling create and setting the reference to that other record would give an error. So to summarize the event pipeline, this is what controls where we'll register. We can register plugins to invoke in stage 10, stage 20, and stage 40. We can't register against stage 30. That's where the main operate. That's where CRM does its actual work. That's where it goes and creates the record, updates the record, marks an opportunity as one. That's where all that work happens. Let's look at an example of a pipeline for a creative an account. Since I've used that example a couple times to talk through this, let me make it a little bit more real with some examples of what you might do during that. So in this one, in stage 10, I might check if the credit limit's too high, throw an exception before the transaction started. If no credit limit was specified, I might do a query to another CRM entity that maybe had a list by country of what the default credit limit should be, and then I could set the value in memory. In the core operation, that's where CRM creates the actual record in the database, and in the post-event, post-operation stage, that's where we would create the follow-up task to follow up on this new account. I talked briefly earlier about synchronous and asynchronous. I want to drive home a few more points because I think it's important to understand the distinction between the two different approaches. First of all, synchronous, the user has to wait for it to complete. So you want plugins to always be as fast as possible, but realize that it was synchronous that they are going to be waiting. There's less overhead to manage the synchronous because it doesn't have to track work that's going to be queued up for execution in the background. Synchronous can run pre and post operation. So on the event pipeline, you have full ability to register in all the stages that can register a plugin against. Whereas with an asynchronous plugin, you can only register in the post operation stage. You can't fire off a pre-event asynchronous request. Asynchronous requests always happen in the background after the main operation has completed. So if you want that, user to see the results, that's when you use synchronous. If it's okay to not happen right away, that's where asynchronous. Asynchronous is not part of the database transaction. It fires off and runs that asynchronous once the transaction has been committed on the main operation. Another important thing to remember is you can actually change this by the registration, not by changing the code. So it's something to keep in mind in your plugin code when you're writing it. You don't have control how an administrator or somebody might register your code. So things like what message is being processed, what stage you're running in, whether you're asynchronous or not, those things you may want to check and understand the environment. So we'll talk about the plugin context. You'll see examples of that. You can check that to determine if you're running on the right entity, the right message, because if you're not running on the right place, it could have been just an error how it was hooked up. I think we've talked about enough. Let's jump in and build a quick demo and see how we can create a plugin. In this demo, I'm going to go ahead and create our first plugin. What we're going to do is create a plugin that is going to run on Creative Account. We're going to check and set the default credit limit, and then we'll do some other things as we go through the rest of this module. I'm going to start by going into Visual Studio, doing a File, New Project. I'm going to go to the Windows and select Class Library. I'm going to go ahead and give it a name, PS Plugins. I'm going to go ahead and create the project. Now you get a class 1. We can either go ahead and delete that or rename it. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that and go ahead and create my own class. New item. We'll go ahead and call it Set Default Credit Limit Plugin.cs. Now we have an empty class. Now we need to go ahead and make the class itself public in scope. And before we can reference iPlugin, we need to go ahead and add a reference to the assembly. There's two ways to do that. One, you can right-click Add Assembly Browse. You could also go into Manage NuGet and search for Dynamic CRM. Right now, we're going to go ahead and add reference by doing a browse. I'm going to CSDK bin, and in the bin folder, we're going to add a reference to Microsoft.xrm.sdk.dll. Now we're going to go ahead and implement the interface, iPlugin. Go ahead and resolve that. So that resolves to using with Microsoft.xrm.sdk. That'll add the using on there. We also want to come down here and implement that interface. So I'm going to choose Implement iPlugin, and it's going to create a shell of the single method that's required by that interface, the execute method, which is passed an iService provider. We're going to use the iService provider later. And right now, we're going to go ahead and leave the not implemented exception in there for right now. We'll be replacing that with some code doing some different things as we get later in this module. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and add a strong name to this assembly. That's required for all plugins. So I'm going to go to Properties on the project. I'm going to go down to Signing. I'm going to sign the assembly. I'm going to choose New to create a new one. I'm going to call it ps4.snk. I don't want to protect it with a password, and that's all that is required to go ahead and set up the strong name. We'll go ahead and build the project. We have a clean build. We have now created our first plugin. Now, technically, we haven't done anything to register this with CRM. We'll do that later. And if we did register it, we'll see that it throws an error. But for right now, I want to keep the code the way we have it. This is the basic setup for the bare minimum to implement a plugin. Obviously, it's going to throw an error, but we'll fill in that code as we get a little further in the future demos in this module. Now that we've created our first plugin, let's talk a little bit about where this plugin executes and get it registered so it'll actually be invoked by CRM. When we think about where the plugin executes, it's important to understand that CRM has a couple of options that support different types of deployment scenarios. The first is executing in full trust. In this scenario, a plugin will run in the hosting process, which will either be the W3P process for the IIS in the case of a plugin that's running synchronous, or if it's running asynchronous, CRM has an async service that runs as a Windows service that will host the process. Now, in both these scenarios are considered full trust or non-isolated, meaning that one plugin could impact and access resources that you might not want to do in a shared type of environment. To support CRM online environments, as well as on-premise where you want to have more protection, CRM implemented a concept called sandboxing. When a plugin is registered to execute in the sandbox or in isolated mode, it's going to execute in a special Windows service called the sandbox process. In the sandbox process, a unique app domain is created to isolate one CRM organization from another CRM organization. Remember, from our architecture discussion early on, one CRM deployment can support multiple CRM organizations running the same deployment, and it's important to keep things separated and not have one organization impact another. That's where the sandbox comes into play. Generally speaking, I like to recommend always build your plugins so that they can run in the sandbox unless there's something explicitly that you need to be able to run within the full trust. In order to deploy to CRM Online, you have to support the sandbox. There's no option for full trust or not running in the sandbox if you're deploying your solution to CRM Online. So what does the sandbox offer? What are some of the limitations? Well, the biggest thing it offers is the isolation, but there's also some things you need to be aware of when you're working in the sandbox. First of all, this is configured at the time of registration. So in fact, if you need to, in an on-premise configuration, it is possible to take a plugin that is registered as isolated, running in the sandbox, and change it to run unisolated in full trust. You might ask, why would I want to do that? The most common scenario that I've run into that is it's late in the evening on Friday, the last day of the month. You need to get month-end processing done, and you found out you exceeded the 2-minute time limit, and you need to be able to run month-end that right then. So that might be a scenario you might configure it back to run full trust, get it to run, and then put it back, and then work through before the next month-end, figure out how to get it to run in a shorter time. Now, what are some of the common limitations? This is not a full list, but these are the ones that I find you run into most of the time. The first is the biggest. Execution time is limited to 2 minutes. This is not a configurable option on-premise or in the cloud. It's 2 minutes. Generally speaking, you don't want your plugins to run that long. Plugins should run a second, half a second, a few seconds. You should be thinking in those time frames as you're getting on longer plugins. Realize that users are going to become real impatient, and usually what happens is you get into longer running plugins, you run into more lock contention and other things that ultimately will kill the transaction before you hit the 2-minute transaction limit that's imposed by the sandbox. You also don't have access to local resources. So if you're used to accessing the file system, logging something to the event log, using the registry, anything else that's local, you're not going to have access to that. You would get an access error if you tried to reach out and touch any of those during execution. It would terminate your execution of your plugin. You're also limited on your network access. You're perfectly free to go out, unless somebody's locked it down even further, doing HTTP or HTTPS calls to fully qualified domain names, but you can't do to other ports, and you also can't do to IP addresses and 127.0.0.1 like a local IP address. That wouldn't work. You'd need to have a fully qualified domain name. The final one, reflection to only public properties, is a little sneaky because most of the time I see this come in to cause problems. It's not your own code that causes the problem. It's where you're using a library. For example, I recently did some stuff with the Azure storage libraries, and it turned out internally they do some deep reflection, and when I went to call it the first time, it gave an exception. I was able to work around it by using the REST interface instead of the class library that they provide that has some nice wrappers, so I had to do a little bit more work. But the key point here that I want to make you aware of is that you can only do reflection to public properties, and that's true of anything that you call as well that's not whitelisted on the CRM server. What I usually recommend to make sure you don't hit any of these sandbox type limitations, do a little proof of concept where you actually try the library that you're trying to use, make sure the calls work before you get too invested in case you have to work on a workaround and do it a different way to get it to work. The other thing I want to touch on real quick before we move on to talk about registering your plugin and getting it connected up, I think it's important to be aware of that your plugin can execute, that the class instance can be reused. So when you build your plugins, whether it's running in full trust, whether it's running in the sandbox, you want to build your plugins to be, stateless, not store any class level variables. Just use the local variables within the method because those are put on the thread stack, and make sure that you don't do anything that you're assuming is going to come back. The other thing to realize is it is possible to have multiple hosting processes run it. So I've seen sometimes where people will try to cache, and some of the things work well within a single service, but they don't scale out as the deployment grows. So you want to be careful of that. Keep your code simple using a stateless development paradigm. Now let's talk about getting your plugin registered. There are three real basic ways that you can accomplish this. The first is using the plugin registration tool. It's a standalone utility that allows you to register your plugin with CRM and set up the individual steps on the messages that you want your plugin to be invoked. The tool uses the standard APIs, so technically if you wanted to, you could go write a standalone, C# program that actually does the registration. It's a little tedious, but you can completely do that with the APIs. The third way is using the developer toolkit. So we'll see later on the developer toolkit has support for defining and capturing what messages you want your plugin to run against and taking care of the deployment to CRM. Now, once you've done this once in a CRM organization, the plugin is put as part of a solution. That solution is then moved from dev to test to production, and that's how your plugin moves between the different environments. You don't actually have to run these registration tools in production, for example. The way you would get it to production is by moving the solution that you've already created and registered the plugin in your development environment. Let's go ahead and register our plugin to actually be invoked, because all we've done so far is we've built the class library. Now let's go ahead and upload it and get it hooked up to an event so that our code gets executed. Okay, now that we've gone ahead and built a plugin, we need to register it with CRM and connect it to one of the event messages that we want it to be invoked for. So we're going to do that by using the plugin registration tool. In this example, I'm going to go into SDK Tools, Plugin Registration, and I'm going to go ahead and launch the plugin registration tool. Now, the first time you use the plugin registration tool, you have to create a new connection. So we're going to go ahead and do that. That's where you give the server name. If you're using CRM Online, you choose Office 365. And you'll notice as you change these different things, it'll ask, so if you were using online, it would ask the region and then prompt you from there for your user and credentials. You don't have to know the server URL. It interprets that from your user and password in the case of Office 365. In the case of on-premise, though, you would need to give the information, which is what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and use the default credentials, and I want a list of all the organizations that are in that particular CRM deployment. I'm going to go ahead and choose the PS4 for part 4 of the developer course and go ahead and get logged in. And what it's doing there is loading all the existing plugins and things that are registered. And you can see some of these are for example, the activity feeds. If you go ahead and expand that, you'll notice that these are plugins that are provided by CRM registered. And if you expand one of these, you can always look to see, there's one on add to queue. And if you want to be a little curious of what they're doing in one that they provide with the system, you'll notice that this is on the add to queue message. Its primary entity is the queue item. They're using the configuration parameters. So these allow you to pass information into the plugin. There's an unsecure and secure. The big difference is the unsecure. If you have an offline plugin, that unsecure also goes down to the offline plugin on the client workstation. location, whereas the secure is only available to plugins that execute server side. And we'll actually be configuring this for ours in a second. I just wanted to show you one that was already done. Next thing you're going to do is register your new assembly. So you're going to go ahead and register a new assembly. It's going to bring you up. Now the easiest way to get this is to jump back to Visual Studio and use the location of your DLL, your assembly, because that's what you need to load in here. So let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is on the solution, I'm going to go ahead and open Folder in Explorer. This gives me the location. I'm going to go into the bin, debug, and I'm just going to grab that URL and we're going to take that back and use that in the plugin registration tool. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and do a browse. We're going to plug in that location. There's our PS plugins. Go ahead and load assembly, and you'll notice that it found our plugin that we created that because it implemented the iPlugin interface. This is where you determine the isolation mode. So sandbox is what we're going to use. I always recommend that unless you have an explicit reason to use none. None runs in full trust. Obviously gives you some more flexibility, doesn't have the time limits, but it also limits you from being able to deploy that plugin to CRM online, which ideally if you build solutions, build them so that they can be deployed to all the different types of CRM deployments unless you have a reason to take a particular single platform dependency. The next thing you have to decide is the location where the assembly will be stored. You have three options: database, disk, and GAC, global assembly cache. Now, typically I recommend database because what happens is it's stored in the CRM database, and if you have multiple CRM servers as part of your deployment, it gets replicated across automatically. You don't have to do anything yourself. If you use disk or GAC, you're responsible for registering it and getting it on each of the servers. Disk has the added benefit if you are doing debug and you want to have the PDB file in there and get some additional debug information in some of the error messages, you can use disk for that and have a little bit of advantage. Generally, recommendation though is to use database because that does let you package it as part of a solution and deploy it across multiple CRM nodes, and it transports easily from one deployment to the next as you move from dev to QA to production. Now we're ready to go ahead and click register selected plugins and let it go ahead and register that. And you want to see it where it comes back and see it says one assembly registered and one plugin registered. We'll go ahead and click OK, and then we'll go back and look. And now if we collapse this, we'll see that what we have here is that our plugin has now been registered. Now you'll notice, unlike the other one, we didn't have any steps below it. This just registers the type, doesn't cause anything to be executed. So if we left it like this, our plugin would never run. We actually have to come in here and right click and register a new step. This is where we'll configure what message we want to receive, and let's go ahead and configure our new message. Now, on here, we'll go ahead and specify the message. Now, in ours, we want to use create, but I want to show you that some of these options, like filtering attributes, are specific to the type of message. So if I choose filtering attributes on account, you'll notice that this lights up and I can go ahead and select it. And what it's going to do is show me a list of all the attributes that are on account. And you'll notice that by default, it selects all of them. This is really bad. You never want to have all attributes selected unless that's what you really intended. But what that would mean is that if any of these attributes change, your plugin would be invoked. Generally speaking, if you're doing an update type plugin, you want to have one or two attributes that you're being triggered off of. Otherwise, you're going to trigger too frequently, and that's going to cause some problems. So we'll go ahead and go back. I'm going to go back to create, and we're going to create this on account. It has our plugin selected. We're going to choose pre-operation because we want to change the value before it happens. This is where you choose synchronous or asynchronous, server versus offline. Like I said, generally speaking, offline is not used. I've seen probably 0.5% of plugins built using the offline mode. It is powerful if you need to use it, but it does require some extra deployment on each of the clients to whitelist the plugins that you want to run. And then we'll go ahead and register our new step. Now, at this point, we've now registered to receive events, create on account, we'll call our plugin. What I want to do now is jump over to CRM and take a look at creating an account. It's going to throw an exception, but I want to show you what that exception looks like when a user gets that. So let's go ahead and jump over to CRM. Okay, so I'm going to go over to accounts. Now remember, I expect this to cause problems. We're going to get an exception, but it gives you a chance to see what that looks like before we go add some real code to get this to work the way we want it to work. So we're going to go ahead and provide, it really doesn't matter what we put in here. I'm going to put an account name of Dave LLC, and I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and we're going to get an error message on here. There we go. And business process error is the generic error that comes up. It's going to tell you that unexpected exception. Now, if you had been in control and you caused the error to happen because, let's say, a validation issue, this message under the business process error would be the text you provided to an invalid plugin exception message that you could throw. You can download the log file. So this would be what you would do if you had tracing. That's where you would find the tracing in a synchronous plugin. In an asynchronous plugin, you would go to Systems, Jobs, and in there you'd see an instance that was failed, and you'd open the download log. The same contents would be in there. So that's we've now registered the plugin. We're now ready to move on and actually build out some of the actual execute method. And let's move on and talk about what types of things you might do there. Now that we've built a real basic plugin, we've gone ahead and registered it so it would be called. Let's go ahead and start talking about how we do some actual logic in it and how we can figure out some information about the execution context from within our code. We do that using the plugin execution context, which tells us information about not only who invoked that plugin, but also gives us access to the input and output parameters. So we'll talk in a second about how to get this object, but you get this object and then you can interact with some primary properties that are very useful. The first one is the message name. You always want to make sure that you're being called for a message that you're expecting to be processed. Imagine if you were called for the one opportunity message when you were really thinking you were going to be called for the create. So you want to use the message name property to check whether it's the message you're expecting. You want to check the stage. Stage tells you whether it's pre-operation, post-operation. Again, that's important to check because imagine if you were expecting to be called pre-operation, you are updating the in-memory version of the request to change some values before the record was created. But imagine if you were really registered in the post-operation stage, your plugin would do nothing, and the result would be very mysterious of why nothing happened because of that error in registering it. The primary entity name lets you check to make sure that you're being invoked for the entity that you expect. Again, imagine that you wrote your plugin expecting to be passed a create of a contact, when in reality you were passed the create of a contract. Very different entities. They don't have the fields that you would be expecting, and you would not have the correct processing occur by processing a contract entity instead of a contact. The input parameters is where you find the request message properties that were passed in. So take a create request. It has a property called target. Target is of type entity, and it's going to point to the entity record that you're trying to create. So if you want to have access to what is about to be created, you would look in the input parameters collection for a property named target. It would be of type entity. You could change values on it, and when that record was created, those values would already be set. The output parameters is the response properties. So it would be what properties would be available on the response object if you looked at it once you got it back from making the call. This is only available after the main CRM operation has actually created the response from processing the request object that came in. So continuing on my example of the create request, in the output parameters, you would be able to get the ID that was assigned to the record that was just created after the create operation completed. Now that all sounds great, and you might be wondering, how do I get this iPlugin execution contest? Well, remember when our execute method got called, we were passed one variable, the service provider. That has one method on it called getService. And if you pass a type, in this example, type of iPlugin execution context, it's going to return an instance of an object that implements that, giving us access to all the properties and several more things like the caller ID, the organization ID. Those are all available in the plugin execution context. You can also use the service provider getService to get the iOrganization service factory. So that is the gateway to being able to create instances of the iOrganization service. You would do this if you want to use organization service calls, for example, to retrieve other data, create other records. You would first go through and get an instance of the iOrganization service factory, use the create instance on that to get an iOrganization service, and then you would do the normal calls against the CRM service that you would be wanting to do to create, modify, query other data. iTracing service is another service that you can get from the service provider getService. And again, you would do it the same way, passing type of iTracing service, get the tracing service back, and then you'd be able to output traces. I highly recommend traces as a way to provide diagnostic information even when you're running in a production environment, because the tracing is only showed in the cases where an exception occurs. You're not incurring a lot of overhead for having a few traces in your code. It's certainly worth it when something goes wrong in production. So let's take a look at getting the context and using the different services. Okay, let's now build out the actual code for our plugin. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and get rid of what we had here by default, which was the throw not implemented exception. We want to go and start working with the plugin execution context so we can find out some information, validate that we're being called where we expect. Now, generally speaking, I like to put as little code as possible in the execute and structure code. What I'm going to do here, though, is I want to walk through some of the things that we're going to do. I'm not going to spend as much time structuring the code for this particular example, but keep that in mind when you're building your real plugin. So the first thing I want to do is actually go get the plugin execution context. Now the next thing we want to do now that we've got the plugin execution context is start checking some of the fields. So the first thing we want to check is that we're being called in the right stage. So if we're not being called in 20, which is the pre-operation stage, remember we have 10, 20, and 40 are the stages we can run plugins in. We want to run in the pre-operation because we want to modify values that are before the actual create of the record happens. So what we're going to do is throw an invalid plugin execution exception and pass a message saying that we're not running in the pre-operation stage. Somebody probably just registered this in the wrong stage, not a big deal. Let's take a quick second and go to definition on the plugin execution context. So I'm going to come up here, go to definition, and you'll notice that it actually implements the I execution context. So it gets most of the things other than stage from the execution context. And if we look at that, you'll see that this has a number of other fields that we haven't talked about, everything from the business unit ID, of the initiating user ID. We talked about input parameters, is in transaction. If you're doing offline, you can check if you're executing offline. You can also check if it's being played back online, which means that the originally ran offline and now it's running again on server. So that would be where you check both server and offline support. Message name. So a lot of the different things that we have access to be able to work with. So this is a very important connection to the event that's being processed by CRM. Let's go back to the code and add two more checks. Two other things I want to make sure are there. I want to check the message name because we're expecting to be called only on create. And I also want to check that the primary entity is, if it's not account, then I essentially want to abort as well. Tell them that we only support account. You know, this goes back to, remember that it's very easy. You can change these by registering the code to different things. None of the code has to change, but your code typically is very dependent on being called for the stage, message, and primary entity. Those are some assumptions usually made by the code in the plugin. So it's always good to validate those before you get too far down into your code. Next thing I want to do is go ahead and get an instance of the tracing service. I'm going to do a similar type of call with the service provider get service past the type of iTracing service. iTracing service is a simple interface that has one method called trace that allows us to write things out, and that trace information is only available if an unhandled exception occurs. We'll take a look at that in a bit when we run this to see the trace that we output in case of an error. Calling the tracing service is rather easy as well, so I'm going to go ahead and add a call in to just simply say hello world from the plugin, or just hello from the plugin. And again, that will only show up if an exception occurs. So now that we've done that, let's start using the plugin execution context to find out what input parameters were passed. Specifically, we want to get the entity that is going to be created, in this case the account, because we want to check the country code and use the country code to look up on another entity that has a default credit limit that we want to set. So to get the account information for the account that's about to be created, we're going to look in the input parameters for the target property that's been set. Now, target is on the create request, and it's the entity that contains the account information. Now, because this is a record being created, the properties or attributes of that account entity are only going to be the ones that the user filled in on the form. So we're not going to get those for any nulls or anything like that, just where the users provide information in some of the system fields like date created, created by, and so forth like that. Once we've gotten that, we can check to see whether the country code was provided, because we're going to use the country code to do the lookup. We also want to check to see whether a credit limit has already been set, because if a credit limit has already been set, we don't need to do a default. So let's do that first. Let's check to see if the credit limit field has been populated. To give us a few little breadcrumbs in case something goes wrong, I'm going to add in first a trace call that says we're about to check the credit limit is set. We're going to use the contains function on the credit limit attribute to see whether the credit limit was already specified. Now this checks to see not for a specific value, but whether it was in the input attributes for the account that was being created. We could also proceed to get the value and check specific values, but we're going to just leave it. If it's provided at all, we're going to let it go through and move on to get the country code and do a query. So again, what I'm going to start with is leaving a little breadcrumb with the tracing. I'm going to say I'm about to get the country code from the account. So if something goes wrong, that will be kind of my anchor point for figuring out what my problem might be. I'm going to take a country code variable and I'm going to check the contains to see if the country code was provided. And then I'm going to use the get attribute value function. We saw that earlier when we were working with the entity to get a string value of the country code. Now what I want to do is use the country code to find out what the default credit limit would be for that particular country. We have another entity that has a list of country code and default credit limit values, a currency field. And what we want to do is do a query. So in order to do a query, the first thing I'm going to do is get an instance of the organization service factory and then use that to create an instance of organization service that I can do queries with from within the plugin. To get the factory, I'm going to go back to the service provider interface helper and use a type of iOrganization service factory. That's going to give me back the instance. This does not allow me to access the CRM services. It allows me to create an instance of the iOrganization service by providing it what user I want to impersonate or not impersonate. So I have options of providing a specific user. I can use the system account, or I could go with who initiated the request that caused the plugin to be invoked. What we're going to do for our request, we want to use the system account. So I'm going to do a call to the create organization service and pass a null. That null indicates that I want this to be called using the service account. I could also provide from the context a specific user ID that invoked it. I could also look up on another record. And as long as I had access to be able to do that, which I would as running as a plugin, I could elevate or act on behalf of another user to perform an operation. In this case, I want to use the system account because I don't want to worry about giving all users access to that default credit limit entity. This allows me to elevate the permissions in the plugin. Now we're ready to build our query object. So I'm going to go ahead and build a query expression using the country code that I got from the input parameters, and then I'm going to search for the entity snap default credit limit. I'm going to pull back a single field. Remember, it's always good to pull back the least amount of fields that you need or columns because the more you pull back, the more data that you're retrieving. Always good to have that be a limited scope. And what we're really interested in is the credit limit because that's what we want to set in the credit limit on the account if we've successfully matched this up. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and do a query or execute this query using retrieve multiple. So using the instance of the service iOrganization service, we're going to call retrieve multiple, pass that query, and that's going to give us back the result. So it's going to get back 0 to many, depending on whether the country matched. Now, you might be wondering, I didn't check to see if the country code was, blank. If the country code is blank, guess what? It's not going to match. And for our purposes right now, I'm going to keep that simple. You might want to differentiate some of the other conditions and some more error handling things like that. I'm trying to keep us focused on trying to get through some basic logic here, so keep that in mind. But what I do want to do is if there were no matches, I'm going to trace out how many records we got back. So I'm going to use the .count. And then I'm also going to do a check if the count 0, throw an invalid plugin exception saying the default for that country code is not configured. And that'll give the message back. And we'd also get the tracing information back. And we'll actually try that when we try to execute this. Now, what I need to do finally is go ahead and set the default value. So we can go ahead and get the credit limit that we want to set from the retrieved record and go ahead and set that in the account entity that is about to have the create called on it. So let's go ahead and do that. Again, I'm going to do a small little trace out here first. And the trace is just another breadcrumb, so I know if something goes wrong. I am, again, making a little assumptions that, there is at least one. We did check for 0. Again, you may want to have a little bit cleaner code when you're doing this for real. But what I really wanted to show you is that we're taking the account entity we got from the target. So that's our in-memory representation of the account instance that's about to be created. And what we're doing is getting the value from the credit limit on the other entity that we queried, and we're setting that in memory. Now, because we're running in the pre-operation, that's all we have to do. When the record is created on the CRM database, it will have that value in it. We don't have to do an explicit update. If you were running this post-operation, what you would have to do is another service.update on the entity to make sure that you actually save the changes. Whereas when you're running pre-operation, you can modify the request in memory before CRM actually processes it. At this point, we're actually ready to go ahead and build our plugin, make sure we get a clean compile. What we need to do anytime we change the plugin, we have to go back to the plugin registration tool and re-upload the assembly. So we double click on the plugin assembly in the plugin registration tool. We browse to the path where the plugin is, and we go ahead and click update, and that updates it in CRM. Now what I'm going to do is jump over to CRM and let's try executing our plugin. Okay, here we are back in CRM. The first thing I wanted to show you is the default credit limit entity. I created this entity with 2 records in it, UK and US. They both have different values. If we were to look at them, the US has 500 and the UK has 1,000. What we're going to do is go back over to our accounts, and we haven't created one successfully because we blew up before, so I'm going to go ahead and try creating a new one. And the first thing I'm going to do here is we'll call this test US. And we're going to go ahead and provide a country code of US. Go ahead and save. Happens pretty quickly here. And if we scroll down, we'll see that the credit limit has been set to 500. If I do the same thing, test UK, and we're going to set the country code to UK, and go ahead and hit save. Notice that I don't even have any idea that something's running. That's the power of plugins. They happen so quick, and there's my credit limit set to $1,000. Now, let's go back. It probably should be £1,000 or 386 or some value like that. Now let's try Germany. And so we're going to provide a country code of DE, which is not on our list. So I expect this to give an error. And so there you see default for country DE is not configured. And if I go ahead and download the log file, open that, you'll notice that what we have is the exception that occurred, and most importantly, we got our trace that we output. So that's kind of showing how we've actually filled out the code, we've deployed it again, we've run it, we've seen how we can do queries, use the organization service, and let's move on and talk about some other things with the rest of the plugin module. Now, so far in the examples, we've created just a standard class library, a standard class. We started from scratch. We implemented the iPlugin interface. We had to do all the code to get the instances of the service factory, and nothing was done for us. So you might be wondering, are there some tooling around that makes this a little easier, maybe gives a framework or some templates for being able to create that? And that's where the CRM Developer Toolkit comes in. A CRM Developer Toolkit is a Visual Studio add-in, so it integrates with Visual Studio to provide a couple of things. First of all, it provides some project templates, one of them being a plugin project. The plugin project provides a template for building plugins. We'll talk more about that in a second. There is also a CRM package project. The CRM package project understands how to deploy web resources as well as other assets like plugins to the CRM server. Now, when you create a plugin template project using the CRM Developer Tool template, it adds in for you a plugin base class. Now, this plugin base class has kind of a plugin development pattern that it uses to minimize redundant code. So a lot of the work to be able to get the organization service, to get a tracing service, that's all done for you, and you're handed a local context that you don't have to do that work on your own. And we'll see that as we go through. I'll actually build a similar plugin to what we've built already, and you can see the difference between using just a regular project and having to do all the work, and using the developer toolkit where some of the work is done for it. Now, once you've added the project in, the plugin template, and you've added the package project template in, then you would go to CRM Explorer, which is a panel that is the add-in creates within the Visual Studio environment. From within there, you'll see a list of entities. If you right-click on account, let's say, you can say create plugin, and then it will bring up a dialog very similar to what you would see when you register a step in the plugin registration tool that lets you provide the settings, the name of the class, and then it creates the class for you that inherits from that plugin base class. So enough talking about it. Let's go ahead and get started with building a plugin using the Developer Toolkit. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and now do the same plugin but use the Developer Toolkit so you can kind of contrast the difference between the two approaches. So I'm going to go ahead and start a new project. We'll go ahead and close this one, go ahead and do a new project. The first thing I'm going to do is go down to Dynamic CRM. Now these are the templates I've added via the Developer Toolkit in the SDK. I'm going to go ahead and choose a package project to start with. This holds a variety of resources from web resources. It also takes care of deploying the plugins and workflow activities that you might build. We're going to go ahead and connect to our server. Notice we're doing this early now instead of waiting to get into the plugin registration tool, which we won't need to do. I'm going to go ahead and connect. We'll then proceed to go ahead and use the default credentials. If you were using an online org, you'd obviously provide your online credentials. Go ahead and log in. We'll choose the organization next. I'm going to choose PS4 that we've been working with, and I'm going to put the plugin in the Snapographs photograph leasing project because that's where we want to deploy QA eventually, and we'll go ahead and click OK, and it'll create the project template. And you can see we now have a CRM package project. We don't have any web resources. If we did, that's where we'd put them in there. And what we're going to do is go ahead, though, and add a new project additionally to this called a plugin template, so CRM 2013 plugin library. And that's going to launch the Explorer. We'll come back to that in just a second because what I want to do is come down. Let's go ahead and minimize this guy. We'll come back to that in a second, but I want to look at the what you have with the new plugin project that we created. So the most important thing we have is a plugin.cs. This is not where you actually put your plugin code. This is the base class that they provide us with for building the plugin. Let's go ahead and close a few of these. And if you look at this, it implements the iPlugin interface. So it does what we already did before. It also has a new class in here called local plugin context. And what's going to happen is when we tell CRM Explorer to create a plugin, it's going to collect some information about the plugin we want to create, and then it's going to create a class that inherits from this plugin-based class. So let's go ahead and jump into CRM Explorer and go ahead and do that. So I'm going to bring CRM Explorer back. We're going to come back into that. Go ahead and change this to float. We're going to expand it, go to entities, go to account, right click, create plugin, and you're going to see a dialog that looks familiar to you because it's what you would normally do after you built the plugin when you do the plugin registration tool. So what we're going to do is go ahead and do a similar thing we did before. We're going to choose create. We want to run in the pre-operation phase. And it's going to give you a class name. So this is what it's actually going to call the class. You can customize that if you want. That's the default that it generates. And it's going to go ahead when I say OK and add a class to the project. So I'm done with the CRM Explorer. So we'll go ahead and hide that for now. And we go back over here and we look at the pre-account class that was created. We notice it inherits from plugin, and all our code, we don't implement the execute method anymore. Our code is going to go inside the execute pre-account create method. And you'll notice it's passed us a local context, and using that local context, you can see that it has plugin execution context. So if I wanted to get the input parameters, I don't have to go look that up and do the get service. Same thing if I want to go use tracing, I can just use trace and trace out the message. And if I want to use the organization service, I can just say organization service.create or query or retrieve, I should say, and those are all there. So that's where we would put all the logic we built and all the effort that we had to do to look up, get the service for the context, get the service for the tracing, get the service for the organization service. That's all done for us by the local context. Now, when we're ready to deploy this, we'd simply right-click deploy. And it would go through, we forgot to put our public key on. We still have to do that. It doesn't do it for us. So we're going to go over here, properties, just like we did before. Sign the assembly, create a new one. Don't want to protect it with a password. Go ahead, right-click deploy. And that takes care of deploying to CRM. So we never have to use the plugin registration tool in this scenario. We can use just the developer tools. So that's a different approach like I said, if you're starting out new, building your first plugin, this is nice because it gives you a little bit of a framework. You're focused more on the code that you want to implement rather than have to worry about getting services and everything else. So now that you've built a plugin, you've seen a couple approaches to do that, both using the low-level class as well as the developer toolkit. You might be wondering, how do I debug these things in case I have a problem? Well, of course, my answer to that is just write good code and then you don't have to debug. I say that only partially kidding, but more realistically, what I'm saying by that is the more code that you put in the actual plugin class, the harder it is to debug. For example, if you were to take the business logic, put it in a business logic class with a method called run business logic, and in your plugin class, all you did was call that, then you could do the same thing from a unit test, meaning that you could use the standard unit test debugging philosophies for being able to debug and test your code. Now, there are other things you can do to help make your code a little bit more resilient and to work through problems. Let's talk about them. The tracing service is probably your next line of defense. Even if you use the unit test philosophy, you can still have some problems in production. If you put some tracing calls in there, those tracing calls are output to the system job in the case of an async plugin, and they're output to a download message that the user could provide you a list of the tracing. Now, you want to make sure when you use the tracing service like this that you don't trace any sensitive information. For example, if you had the social security number or government ID for a customer, it might not make sense to trace that out because it would be visible without any security restrictions in the log. Now, I can hear you saying, Dave, can I just run the debugger? That's what I'm used to doing. Yes, you can. So if you're an on-premise, or let's say you have your own development environment that has an on-premise CRM with CRM deployed to it, with your solution deployed, your plugin there, you can go ahead, depending on which mode you're running into. If you're running in full trust, you'd attach to the IIS process for the CRM hosted application in IIS. If you're running an async process or plugin, you would attach to the async service. If you're running in isolated mode, you would attach to the sandbox service. Be aware in the SDK there's a registry entry that defines that you want to run the debugger for the sandbox. Otherwise, what's going to happen is after 30 seconds, it's going to detach after it kills the process for being non-responsive. Now, if all you have available to you is CRM Online, this doesn't help you. You can't just run a debugger, and in most production environments, realistically, you're not going to have the ability to do that, or if it's an environment that's not controlled like a local development environment. So that's where the plugin profiler solution comes into play. Using the plugin registration tool, you can deploy a solution that will actually capture what would normally be passed in as input to your plugin. Once you've captured that, then you can replay that by attaching the Visual Studio Debugger to the plugin registration tool and replay that back through your code. It's almost very close. I wouldn't say it's 100% like attaching to the service running at real time, but it does give you the ability to run your plugin code and replay that message locally. Let's go ahead and jump in and see how we can install the profiler and run through the debugger using the profiling tool. Okay, we're going to now go back into the plugin registration tool and set up to be able to capture the profile information or profile our plugin, capture the information we need to be able to replay and execute the plugin in the local debugger. The first thing we're going to do is click on the Install Profiler. This installs the solution in CRM that allows us to then set up the profiling on our individual plugins. Once the profiler has been installed or the solution has been imported, you'll get the success message. And then the next thing you're going to notice is that at the bottom, there's now a plugin profiler listed in the plugin assemblies that are there. We can ignore that for now. We're going to come up to our individual step to create on the account. We're going to right click on it, and we have a new option here called Start Profiling. We're going to go ahead and set the options up for how we want to capture the profiling. So we're going to go ahead and do the exception. We're going to leave the number of executes and include secure config. We're going to leave that all as default. You could also persist this to an entity, so if you wanted to capture it and not throw the exception, that is an option also, and then you can pull that from the entity to replay it. But we're going to use the exception approach. Now that we have that set up, you can tell it's set up because it says profiled to the right of the item. We're going to go back to CRM, and we're going to go ahead. I still have the invalid country code here. We're going to go ahead and click Save. And you'll notice we get a business processor, but a different message. It's not telling us that the country code is invalid. And the reason for that is what's happened is the profiler is then ejected, and it's basically captured the information that was being passed into our plugin. And we're going to use that to reload back into the profile registration tool and allow us to do the debugging. So I'm going to go ahead and click download the log file. Go ahead and hit save. We can then jump back over to the plugin tool. Back in the plugin registration tool, we're going to click on the replay plugin execution. We're going to go ahead and browse to the location where we saved the log file. We're going to browse to the assembly location. We're going to choose our plugin. It's going to find our plugin that's in there. If we had multiple, we'd choose between them. Go ahead and hit start execution. Now with this, we've been able to simply replay it. So when I run that, it causes it to go through and run the plugin. You'll see the traces down below. Hello from plugin, check if credit limit, check the country, 0 records found. If we view the exception, we'll see our message there. The default country is not configured for that for DE. Now what we can do is attach Visual Studio to this plugin registration process and be able to do some debugging. So let's jump back over to Visual Studio, go ahead and debug. We're going to attach to the process. We're looking for the plugin registration tool. Attach. And what I'm going to do here is go ahead and scroll up a little bit. And let's set a breakpoint so we know where this is. We'll set a breakpoint on the stage. We'll now jump back over to the plugin registration. Go ahead and start execution again. And there we are, jump back into the debugger, and we get full debug support to be able to kind of work through, any errors that we have. I can interrogate. You notice that the context has been brought to life. So if we want to explore, then we can just kind of come down here and we're able to see the context information and just do normal debugging like you normally would. So that's an example of using that support. Again, I always like to try to do some of the unit testing, try to do the tracing, but this is a nice additional way that you can do debugging, especially if you're trying to capture it in CRM Online and you don't have the options of connecting and attaching to the service processes. Well, there we have it. Now that we've gone through and we've set up a plugin, we've seen how to deploy it, we've registered it, we've executed it, we saw how to debug it. Hopefully you can now see how powerful plugins can be. They're one of the deepest extensions of the CRM.